Hi, I'm Nathan Bankston with Bankston Construction in Anchorage, Alaska. And today I want to show you exactly how to prepare and paint a cabinet door to come out with the best, most perfect finish you possibly can. If you want to learn more about me and my company, you can go to bankstonconstruction.com. So there are a few steps that you have to get right in order to get a good adhesion with your paint and a crystal clear, smooth finish to your paint. The first step is to clean. There is, on most old cabinet doors, a thick layer of grease and grime from all of the cooking that's been done over the years. And paint simply will not stick to that. And so on a cabinet door, they're dirty pretty much all over, but there's a few areas, like in the details of the trim on the bottom of the door, and this one's real nasty, right up on the top of the door, where there's just a thick layer of grease. What I like to do to remove that is to get a product called Simple Green. Seems to work pretty well. And a rag of really any kind. You don't want paper towels, they'll disintegrate on you. You just spray some Simple Green into your cloth, get it on the door, and then just scrub it. And you'll see with a little bit of scrubbing that all of that grease and grime will come right off of the door. Paint actually requires a mechanical connection to the substrate that's under it. And if you leave all this grease on here, over time, over 6 months or 5 years, 20 years, whatever it ends up being, that grease will cause the paint to delaminate from the wood. And so it's imperative that we remove all of this and get back down to that wood. So I've got the door clean and have been over it pretty thoroughly to remove all of that nasty grease. The next step is to sand the door to promote that mechanical connection between the paint and the wood. We give the wood a good scuffing with sandpaper to let the paint grab onto something. It gives it kind of a groove to get into and latch into the wood. It helps us not have to come back and repaint cabinets later, which is a good thing. There's also, on almost all doors, these little pads that need to be taken off, and then a little bit of adhesive behind them that needs to be scraped off. Same situation as with the grease and the grime. If you leave that little bit of adhesive there, the paint won't stick and it will come off over time. So after your door is clear of hardware, you want to grab some little sanding pads, also just some sheets of 220 or higher grit. You could do 300 grit if you wanted. I like 220. And we'll just run over the whole door and scuff it. You can take a sheet of 220 and flip it over upside down, and just take a knife. You can also do this with a pair of scissors if you want, and cut your sandpaper into quarters. This gives you some manageable pieces to work with. Now the quarter sheets here we will use with just a block of wood, something to wrap the sandpaper around. They make little sanding blocks that you can buy, but I always seem to lose those, so we use a piece of wood. And we will be sanding all the flat areas like this with a flat block. What you don't want to do is gouge your wood with your fingers and cause little dips in the wood. Especially with a freshly painted surface, if you have a little dip in the wood here, you're going to look across that, the light's going to catch it, and you're going to see that there's a dip. It's very unattractive. So take your flat piece of wood, wrap your sandpaper around it, and just give it a light sanding. It doesn't take a whole lot. Sometimes the wood which you're sanding will be cupped, and you'll be sanding just the outside corners of that face. So just keep sanding for a few seconds until you get through that cupping. Work your way all the way around the frame. And then on the inside panel of the door, if you have a flat panel like this one, it's super easy. Try as you're sanding to kind of sand with the grain of the wood. If you get a lot of sanding action across the grain in this direction, you could get some scratches that come and show through with the paint. If you sand with the grain, any scratches that you cause in the wood will just be with the grain of the wood, and it'll look like more grain. So as much as you can, as much as is possible. When you get up to the edges here, you got to cross sand just a little bit. Just try to keep it to a minimum. Get a good scuff over the entire surface. You're going to do that front and back. Okay, so now that we have our flat surfaces sanded, we want to move to one of these sanding pads, which is just softer. And this happens to be an 80 grit sanding pad that'll work just fine. And there's a few things you got to pay attention to with these curves. One thing is you want to sand inside of the curves to make sure you get good paint adhesion in them. But what you don't want to do is sand off the details of the curves. Specifically, if you come in tight on this door here, there is a hard edge right there, and then we've got a little Roman OG sweep and another hard edge right there. So we want to get into the tighter curve of the middle of that detail, but if you sand off the hard corners there and there, you're gonna have a funny looking door. So you don't want to sand off those corners. So just a little bit of patience and slow work with the edge of the pad to get into the groove underneath that lip. And then a little bit of pressure and maybe bending over the pad to get that detail there. And then take the other edge of the pad and sand that side there. You don't need a lot of sanding on these. If you over sand these, it's gonna look funny after you get it painted, so be careful. Okay, so we've gone through and sanded our door, and now what you need to make sure you do is take your wet rag with water and wipe away all of the dust from sanding from both sides of the door. The dust will interfere with the next step, which is priming the door. I'm using Sherwin-Williams Extreme Bond Primer. It sticks really well to cabinet doors. I've used all-in-one paint and primer before, and I've had varying levels of success, but this always sticks, and so I use it. Primers do basically two functions. First, they help the paint adhere to the door mechanically. But second, especially with these old oak doors from the 70s and 80s, oak has a very strong tendency to wick tannin through the paint. And this primer will actually seal the tannins from the wood so that when you get to your color layer, to your paint, you won't see the tannins through. Basically, you'll end up with these brown streaks that come through your paint. And that's just the tannin, the oils of the wood wicking through the paint. And so this helps stop that. So get yourself a roller and a tin with some primer in it. And then you're going to want to get yourself a brush. There's a lot of brushes to get. You don't need to get the really expensive ones. Just make sure you get one that is angled like this so that you can get into the little nooks and corners in the cabinet door. I want to show you a few important things about using a brush and a roller. This is where a lot of people end up failing with their painting project. Brushes are meant to be used with the paint from the inside of the bristles, not the outside. So you want to dip your brush into the paint, or in this case the primer, and really work the primer onto the inside of the brush. Work not to get the paint up the brush. You really want to keep the paint down at the bottom of the brush. But you want to work it into the inside. And then scrape the paint off of both sides of the brush. And so now I've got paint on the inside of the brush, but not on the outside. That helps us have more control over the paint. So with the brush, we want to work on the details of the door before we roll, because the brush leaves a texture when we paint, and the roller leaves a texture when it paints. But this roller is designed to leave a texture that flattens out when it dries. The brush won't do that so well. So we brush first, and then we roll, and then the roller hides the texture from the brush. When you're brushing into a corner, don't brush into the corner like this, otherwise you'll end up with these huge big pools of paint that will, one, never dry, and also second, drip, and third, you'll lose the details of the trim. So instead of painting into the corner, you actually want to paint away from the corner. So pull the paint. Now I got a bunch of paint in there that I need to get rid of, but pull the brush away from the corners and work towards the middle. And then slowly, you'll get your details painted in. Just work all the way around the door, pulling away from the corners. Grab some more of my extra paint down here from when I messed up. Pull away from the corners. Now, your primer is not going to cover 100%, and that's okay. What you really want is to make sure that you get it into the nooks and crannies. And then we'll do a second layer of primer, maybe, and certainly a couple layers of color, and then that will get your full coverage. So I've got all of my detail trim there painted, and notably, I don't have any extra paint in the corners, nor do I have any extra paint hiding the details of the trim. We want just a thin layer of paint. Many coats of thin paint is your path to success here. So, done with the brush. I'm going to grab the roller. And the roller is much the same story as the brush. You only want a little bit of paint on your roller. If you have too much paint, you're going to have the same problem as the brush. You're going to end up with dripping. You're going to end up hiding the details. The texture on the board is going to be bad. So start rolling in an open area. Get all the paint off of your roller. And then work your way back towards the corner. And I don't press the roller all the way into the corner. I get just close to the corner. Just close enough to where I can just barely kiss that trim and hide those brush marks, but not so close that I smear the roller across the trim. Then you'll end up with more drips. Okay, so you notice you can still see through the primer. That's okay. We'll do a second coat of primer. It'll cover all that right up. But too much paint on at once, you're going to see it in your end result. Now there's two sides to a door, a front and a back, and if you try to do both sides at once, you're going to mess up your paint on one side. So what we're going to do is on the outside edge here, we're just going to get the front half of the profile here, and then we're going to come back through after this is dried and get the back half of that profile along with the back side of the door. Okay, so that is a primed door. We'll do a couple coats of this, and then we'll sand before we put on our color. All right, so we got our first coat done and dried on the primer here, and second coat is basically exactly the same as the first coat. You want to start with your brush and do exactly as we did before in the same order. Now, if you get any sort of drips or areas of the paint that leaves bumps, or you get dust in your paint or anything like that, there's no need to panic about it. You can just wait for your door to dry. After it's completely dry, you can come back with some more of that 220 grit sandpaper and just touch it up. Just sand away the bump or the drip. It's helpful to minimize it so you don't have to waste your time, but it's no emergency if you do get a little drip. The second coat you see covers a lot better than the first coat, and it's still not perfect, but this is just primer, so that is just fine. So now after we've brushed in our details, we'll come back with our roller and get off as much paint as you can off your roller. Start your roller in the middle to get off all the extra paint. And then come in close to the sides after your roller is dry is only when you want to get close to your details. Sometimes painting this half, the front half of this outside detail, will leave a little bit of a paint lip on the back. Again, that's okay. You can just, when you flip your door over to paint the back, which is exactly the same as the front, you can just sand off that little lip, the little buildup of paint that can sometimes happen just before you paint or prime the back. And with that, that is a primed door, ready for paint. I also just want to show you something that can happen sometimes. I mentioned the primer blocks out the tannin, especially in this old red oak. It has a lot of oils that wick back up through the paint. The primer deals with that, but you'll see sometimes there's a little bit of brown that comes through that primer. That's totally fine. This is 2 coats of primer on this door, and that brown is still coming through a little bit, but after that primer cures for a few hours, it'll stop the rest of the tannin from wicking through, and your color will go on just fine. So we have let the door dry for a day now. So far we've cleaned, we've sanded, we've done 2 coats of primer, and now we're just about ready for our color to go on. But before we do that, if you run your hand over your door, you'll feel a little bit of bumpiness to it. And we want to get rid of that. We want to make the primer smooth so that when you put the paint on, you don't have little bumps in your paint. And so we need to do that before we paint. It's recommended to let the primer dry for a day before you try to sand it, so that it doesn't start balling up in your sandpaper. So make sure it's nice and dry, and don't apply very much pressure here. Just barely let the sandpaper drag across the surface of the door, and it will do the work itself. If you press too hard, you're going to work yourself right through your primer, and then you're going to have to reprime again. Just a little bit right over the surface, and I can already, it's glass smooth now, just from that little bit. So we'll just do that over the whole door. And get your pad and just run it real quick over the details. And get the outside of the door. That's it. That is a smooth door. This is a great time if you've caused any dripping in your primer to go back through the sandpaper and just lightly sand the drips back off the door. If you're careful, you can sand the drip back down to even without going through the primer, and then you don't need to reprime. If you sand all the way through your primer, you're just going to need to touch it up. That'll be one more step before you paint, and then make sure you run that sandpaper over it again before you paint. So now we have dust all over our door. We just take a wet rag with some just water, not wet, just barely damp, just to pick up all of that sanding dust, and do all that front and back. So now is finally the fun part, and we've done all of our prep and we are ready to apply color to our door. I like to use Sherwin-Williams Emerald paint. This is in satin, which seems to be pretty good sheen for cabinets. I would just implore you, do not skimp on paint quality here. You want to buy the good stuff. If you go down to your local Sherwin-Williams, or potentially Lowe's if you've got a good guy at the paint counter, tell them you're rolling paint onto cabinets, and they'll hook you up with the good stuff. If you can get Emerald, it's pretty expensive, but it works really well. So we're doing a gray color on these cabinets. You just want to get a smooth surface roller. Some people will get the foam rollers. I would recommend against those. They sometimes deteriorate a little bit and drop some of the foam into the paint as you're painting, and then you gotta go pick it out and sand it back out and repaint. I like the woven smooth surface rollers best, and you don't have to spend a particularly large amount of money on them. But just like with priming, we're gonna start with our brush. I'm gonna dip our brush, scrape all of the paint off the outside of the brush so that we're working from the inside of the bristles, very important. And then we're going to paint our details first, pulling away from the corners. And now that all of our prep's done properly, you see it comes out nice and smooth. So work your way all the way around, being very careful not to put too much paint onto those details. Just like before with the primer, we want thin coats. If you put too much paint on, you're going to ruin all of the hard prep work that you just did with some big old drips, and you're going to have to work backwards to reset. So not too much paint. You can always come back in a few coats. In fact, you almost always want to do 2 to 3 coats. You'll pretty much never get your color on in one coat. There we go, that looks pretty good. So we get our roller, roll some paint onto it, and then roll all the paint off in the pan. Roll the middle of the door to get all of the paint off as much as we can. And then once there's no paint on our roller, very little paint, then we start working into the sides where the details are. Come as close as we can to those side details so we cover our paint strokes, or paintbrush strokes, cover that texture. The other side. And even though we're going to do more than one coat, you really want to shoot for 100% coverage here. Don't leave places bare just because you know you're going to come back with another coat. You want to make sure you get every single little spot. Otherwise you're going to have to do even more coats to cover those spots later. take your time, don't rush it. This is not a fast process. But just like that, we have our first coat of paint on our door. And it's starting to look pretty good. If you look closely at these doors, there are two problems with them so far after the first coat. One is you can still see through the color in some places. And the second is that there's a little bit of bad texture on the door. So maybe a speck of sawdust or a dried piece of paint got into the roller while we were rolling. So we fixed that simply by taking a piece of 220 sandpaper, and just like before with the primer, with knocking those high spots off, it's the same thing. You just want to, so I got a little bump right there, you just want to very, very lightly, no pressure at all, basically, just touching the wood, pull it right off. Again, if you have any drips from your previous coat, you need to get them out before you go for a final coat. Just go around the whole door, just feel it with your hands. I have a little paintbrush mark here. See, I've got a little hair in the paint right there. Pull it out. Another little paintbrush mark down here. Alright, so we're ready for probably our final coat on this door. You might need 3 coats. I'm going to try to get away with 2 on this because we're looking pretty good. So same as before, on your final coat, you want to just be particularly careful to not use very much paint. You want to be able to still see that grain texture through the wood, and hopefully this will be your last coat, which means you won't be able to sand it. The problem areas on these doors are usually the corners where it's kind of hard to get paint into. If you go looking around at other people's houses, which can be kind of weird unless you know the people, you'll see a lot of the corners where people paint, they miss paint, and that's solved simply by just dabbing your brush right into the corner and then pulling it away, same as before. There we go, that looks pretty good. I'm going to get rid of some of my brush strokes by brushing with the grain on the top and bottom of our center panel. Same deal with the roller, get some paint on the roller, push all the paint off the roller as much as you can anyway. Start in the middle, and then edge it in. Try not to touch your detail too much. Just on this last coat, just take an extra second to look everything over and make sure you're not missing anything, making sure you don't have any drips. Because again, if you miss something, you're going to have to go back a step, sand again, and do another final coat. I don't really want to do that. Wherever you choose to paint your cabinets, by the way, you're going to want a lot of light, and it's pretty much for this step right here. I've got big fluorescent overhead lights that shine way more light on me now than what would actually be in a kitchen and where these doors are going. And if you want to improve a paint job on anything, just lower the light level. It'll look better. So we have a lot of light shining down on this door now so that I can make it as absolutely perfect as possible. And then when we install it in the kitchen, you won't be able to see as well as you can see here, and then it will be absolutely perfect looking because we got all the details and mistakes out in the bright light. So you dim the lights, it looks perfect. Yeah, so one side at a time. That's our final coat. We'll let that dry completely, flip the door over, final coat the back side, and then the door is done, ready for hardware and to be installed. Okay, so as you can see, we have a lot of work going on in this kitchen, but now it is time to finally hang our cabinet doors. We've already painted the frames of the cabinet, but these doors are ready to be hung. This is a semi-concealed, I think they call it, hardware. It's an older style hardware from probably the 80s, and it's a little bit annoying to find replacement hardware for this. If you go to rockler.com, they'll have what you need. And this particular door has a slot into which the hinge slides and then clamps onto wood. So there's no screws actually going into the wood of this door at all. It's all done clamping by this little back plate, and then you tighten up that screw, and it just holds the door right on. So it's as easy as putting the hinges onto the frames, and then taking your door and sliding those little back plates into the slots. you take your driver and very gently, you don't need to over tighten these things. That was probably a little too tight. Just throw them in. And then that door is hung. They call them semi-concealed because you can still see a little bit of a hinge out on the outside. But with the new brushed nickel hardware, it looks pretty good. One thing that I opted to do here, I had a little bit of touch-up on the paint to do after our last coat. And so I decided to hang the doors before I do my final coat. And that's just because I don't want to potentially ruin them in transport or anything. Also, I want to see what it looks like in the light of the kitchen here. So I have my last coat of paint ready to go here. And it is the exact same deal as everything else we've done on painting, except this time I don't particularly need a brush. Get your roller, get paint on it, roll all the paint off of the roller. And then this area right here needed some touch up, and so we'll just roll some paint on it to touch it up. And then you can smooth out your paint by just kind of dry rolling it to blend it into what's already been done. You don't have to paint your entire cabinet again, your entire door again. You just go around and touch it up. There we go. And that looks pretty stinking good. Now that it's wet, don't close the door. Otherwise you'll get paint back on your frame and you'll leave a drip. No good. So just leave it open like that. And then once it's dried, that door should be 100% done and perfect. Thank you for watching. If you'd like to see more on how to remodel a house, you can check out our other videos or check us out on our website at bankstonconstruction.com.